What life was like in English cities during the Black Death in the year 1351. What life was truly like when death walked through every street, knocked on every door, and sat at every table. This is not a tale pulled from the dry pages of a history book. This is the raw, unfiltered truth of what ordinary people endured when the world they knew collapsed around them, and all they had left was their desperate will to survive. London, in the early months of 1351, was a city that had already been brought to its knees. The great pestilence had swept across England with a fury that no war, no famine, no flood had ever matched. And though some whispered that the worst had passed, the truth was far more terrifying. The plague had not left. It lingered in the shadows of narrow alleyways, in the stagnant water of the Thames, in the foul air that rose from piles of refuse that no one was left alive to clear. The city that had once been the beating heart of a kingdom now resembled something closer to a graveyard with walls. Thomas Ashford stood at the threshold of his wool merchant's shop on Cheapside, staring out at a street that should have been bustling with traders, carts, and the sounds of commerce. Instead, the lane stretched before him in eerie silence. A gaunt dog trotted past, ribs visible beneath matted fur, sniffing at a pile of rags that Thomas had learned not to look at too closely. Over the past 2 years, you learned not to look closely at anything left on the streets of London. What you saw could haunt you for weeks. Thomas was 43 years old, a solidly built man with a weathered face and hands calloused from decades of handling bales of wool. He had built his trade from nothing. His father had been a tanner in Southwark, a man who died coughing blood when Thomas was barely old enough to fend for himself. Thomas had clawed his way into the merchant class through sheer stubbornness, a sharp mind for numbers, and an instinct for knowing which Flemish buyers would pay a premium for English fleece. By 1348, he had owned a fine shop, employed 3 apprentices, and lived in a timber-framed house with his wife Margaret that would have been the envy of his father. Now, 2 of those apprentices were dead. The third had fled to the countryside and never returned. Half his suppliers had perished. The Flemish buyers had stopped coming because the plague had ravaged Bruges and Ghent just as savagely as London. The wool trade, the lifeblood of England's economy, had been gutted. Margaret appeared behind him in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She was a tall woman, lean and sharp-featured, with dark hair now threaded with silver that had not been there 2 years ago. She had aged a decade in 24 months, and Thomas knew he had done the same. "The baker's wife is dead," Margaret said quietly. Her voice carried the flat, matter-of-fact tone that had become the only way anyone in London delivered such news. There was no shock left. Grief had become so commonplace that it had transformed into something mechanical. Thomas nodded. "When?" "Last night. The neighbors found her this morning. He had been dead 3 days already. No one had checked on them." Margaret paused. "Their house will need to be sealed." Thomas turned to look at his wife. In her eyes, he saw the same exhaustion and quiet terror that he felt every morning when he woke and wondered whether this would be the day the sickness found them. They had been spared so far, and neither understood why. The plague did not discriminate. It took the pious and the sinful, the rich and the poor. The randomness was the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant there was nothing you could do to protect yourself. "I need to go to the Guildhall," Thomas said. "The council is meeting again. They are trying to set new wage laws." Margaret's expression hardened. Wage laws, while people rot in their homes. "The laborers who survived are demanding 3 times the old wages. The landowners are panicking. Everything we knew about how the world works is changing." He kissed Margaret on the forehead, a brief gesture that carried more weight than any words. Every parting carried the unspoken question, "Will I see you again?" Every time Thomas walked out his front door, he was aware that the air itself might be poisoned, that the person he brushed past might be carrying the pestilence without knowing it, that a single flea bite could begin the process that would end with him shivering in his bed, his lymph nodes swelling into agonizing black lumps, his skin mottling with the dark patches that gave the plague its terrible name. The walk from Cheapside to the Guildhall felt like a journey through devastation. Thomas passed houses with doors marked by crude crosses. The smell was the thing he could never grow accustomed to. That sweet, cloying scent of decay, of bodies not collected quickly enough, of the lime pits where the dead were buried in mass graves because the churchyards had long since overflowed. He pulled a lavender-infused cloth over his nose and mouth. He did not believe it truly protected him, but people clung to whatever rituals gave them a sense of control. At the Guildhall, the council was already gathered. William de Harrow, the alderman for Cripplegate, sat with his small, calculating eyes, a man who had not merely survived the plague but profited from it, buying dead merchants' properties for pennies. Brother Edmund, a Dominican friar from Blackfriars, sat gaunt and intense, a man who had spent months tending the dying and watching his fellow friars perish. And Eleanor Byrne, an herbalist and healer, the only woman present, a mark of how the plague had altered the social order. She had copper-red hair, herb-stained hands, and a directness that Thomas found refreshing in a world drowning in denial. "We have a new outbreak in Aldgate," Eleanor said without preamble. "At least 15 dead this past week. The same symptoms: swellings, fever, delirium, dark blotches. The same pestilence. It has not gone anywhere." De Harrow waved a dismissive hand. "The question before this council is economic. The laborers are defying the King's statute. A mason yesterday demanded 40 pence for a week's work. Before the plague, he would have been grateful for 10. Brother Edmund leaned forward. "Perhaps the mason demands more because he knows he is one of the few masons left alive. And perhaps because the cost of bread has tripled."
Thank you so much.
Thomas listened to the argument, the central tension of post-plague England. The feudal system was cracking. The statute of laborers tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but Thomas knew it was a dam built against a flood. "The statute will not hold," Thomas said. Every head turned. "You cannot force a dead man to work, and you cannot force a living man to accept starvation wages when the lord across the river will pay double. The plague has done what no revolt ever could. It has made labor valuable." De Harrow laughed coldly. "Spoken like a man with no tenants." "I am ruined just as surely as any landowner," Thomas replied. "The difference is that I am not pretending the answer lies in turning back the clock to a world that no longer exists." Eleanor broke the silence that followed. "While you gentlemen argue about wages, I have a more immediate concern. The streets are filthy beyond description. The dead are not being collected quickly enough. The water supply is contaminated. If we do not address these conditions, the pestilence will continue to return, and there will be no laborers left to argue about." De Harrow sneered. "And who will pay for this grand cleaning campaign? The treasury is empty." "Then fill it," Eleanor shot back. "Tax the properties you have been buying for nothing from the estates of dead men. Use that money to save the living instead of enriching yourself from the dead." The room went silent. No one had ever spoken to William de Harrow like that, certainly not a woman, and certainly not in a public meeting. De Harrow's face turned a shade of purple that Thomas found privately satisfying, though the moment was too dangerous for anyone to enjoy openly. The meeting produced more argument than action. On his way home, Thomas encountered a mob surrounding Marjorie Dalton, a laundress, accusing her of spreading plague through sorcery. A burly man was shouting at her, "Witch, you brought the sickness to Ludgate. Your neighbor died the day after you brought her clean sheets. You poisoned them." Marjorie was on her knees in the mud, weeping, her basket of clean linens overturned. Thomas stepped forward. "Leave her alone." The tension was thick enough to choke on. Thomas was outnumbered and knew that fear made people capable of terrible things. But something in his calm, firm voice gave the men pause. "The plague is a pestilence that strikes without regard to virtue or sin," Thomas said. "I have watched it take the holiest people I have ever known. If it were God's judgment on the wicked, the churches would be the safest places in England. Instead, the priests are dying alongside the drunkards. Think about that before you accuse an innocent woman." The mob dispersed with grumbling reluctance. Thomas helped Marjorie to her feet and walked her home. The incident chilled him to the bone. The fabric of basic human decency was being torn apart by fear. and Thomas wondered how much more tearing it could withstand before it came apart entirely. He arrived home to find Margaret by the fire. They sat together as the light faded, two survivors in a city of ghosts, holding on to each other because there was nothing else left to hold on to. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because every week we bring you stories that make you see history not as distant facts, but as the raw human experience it truly was. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. The next morning, Thomas found Agnes Woodford at the Crossed Keys Tavern on Friday Street, sweeping the floor with angry, exhausted strokes. Agnes was a formidable woman in her 40s who brewed her own ale and had lost her husband to the plague in 1349. She had carried on alone because carrying on was what Agnes did. "I cannot run this place alone, Thomas," she said. "Between the brewing, cooking, serving, cleaning, and bookkeeping, I am going to work myself into a grave, and I refuse to die of exhaustion after surviving the plague. That would be an insult." Thomas told her about Helena, a widow on Cordwainer Street whose shoemaker husband had died, leaving her with a trade she could not master and savings that were nearly gone. He found Helena sitting on the step outside her late husband's shuttered shop, a woman of about 35 with a round, kind face that bore the marks of prolonged worry. "I have never worked in a tavern," Helena said when Thomas explained the opportunity. "Agnes will teach you. She is demanding but decent." Helena studied his face with the wariness of a woman who had learned that trust was dangerous. "Why are you helping me? You do not know me." Thomas considered the question. "Because someone helped me once when I had nothing. And because in times like these, the only thing that separates survival from destruction is whether people are willing to help strangers. I choose to believe we are." Helena was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "Tell Mistress Woodford to expect me tomorrow morning."
We keep them separated here.
Thomas felt a rare flicker of satisfaction. One small problem solved in a city drowning in problems. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was something. He then visited Brother Edmund at Blackfriars Priory, where 11 friars remained where 60 had once lived. The empty cells and silent corridors spoke to the devastation. "What has changed, Thomas," Edmund said, "is that the survivors have been forced to confront a truth that was always there. Our entire social structure rests on human labor. Remove half that labor, and the structure does not merely weaken, it begins to collapse. The people at the bottom have discovered that they are the ones holding everything up, and they are beginning to ask why they should keep holding it up for the benefit of those at the top." "You sound sympathetic to the laborers," Thomas said. "I am a friar. My order was founded on poverty and service. I have watched the church fail its flock. We told people the plague was God's punishment. Then they watched their priests die alongside everyone else, and they began to wonder if the priests knew anything at all." Edmund's words haunted Thomas. He could feel they were standing at the edge of something vast, not just the end of a plague, but the end of a way of life. That evening, Eleanor Byrne visited their home with medicines she refused payment for. She shared a troubling observation. The plague was spreading fastest near the docks. She believed the ships and the rats aboard them were carrying the sickness into the city. Her intuition was remarkably close to the actual mechanism of plague transmission, centuries ahead of scientific understanding. The plague was indeed carried by fleas on rats, and those rats traveled on ships, spreading the disease from port to port. Eleanor had arrived at this conclusion, not through academic training, but through the simple discipline of paying attention to patterns that trained physicians were too proud to notice.
We did it!
"The areas near the river have 3 times the deaths of the higher ground," she said, spreading her hands on the table. "It is not the air. It is something coming off those ships. I am certain of it." "If you are right," Thomas said, "we should avoid the riverside. I am going to raise it at the council, but Tahara will block any restrictions on shipping. Too much of his wealth depends on the port. That man would let the entire city burn if his warehouse profits were at stake." Thomas organized street cleaning crews around Cheapside, paying from his dwindling savings. He helped Agnes keep the tavern running, hauling barrels and washing dishes. The Crossed Keys had become one of the last anchors of community life. People came not just to drink, but to be around other living people, because sitting alone in a house where your family died could drive you mad. Margaret managed their household with ingenuity, stretching diminishing resources, mending clothes for destitute families, sitting with grieving neighbors. Their relationship deepened in ways that comfortable married life had never demanded. The plague stripped away mundane distractions, leaving the essential core. Two people who chose to face the world together and renewed that choice every day. One evening, Thomas asked Margaret if she still believed in God. She was quiet for a long time before answering. "I believe in something. I am not sure it is the God the church describes, the God of punishment who sends plagues. That God does not match the evidence. But something keeps me going. Call it faith or hope, or just the human refusal to surrender. Whatever it is, I will not let go of it, because it is the only thing that makes any of this bearable." Thomas squeezed her hand. She had spoken for both of them, and for thousands across England grappling with the same impossible questions. The plague had not just killed bodies. It had challenged beliefs, shattered assumptions, and forced survivors to re-examine everything they had been taught about God, justice, and the meaning of suffering. If this story is already making you think about how much the world can change when everything falls apart, leave a comment below. Tell me,
It's a simple miracle.
if you had lived through the Black Death, do you think you would have been a Thomas trying to help, or a De Harrow trying to profit?
They have lost
Be
everything,
honest.
and here they
Eleanor's warnings proved prophetic. The Aldgate outbreak expanded with terrifying speed. The death toll surged. Dead carts ran 3 times daily. Burial pits were reopened. Eleanor established a treatment center in a vacant warehouse, recruiting women who had themselves survived the plague. "We cannot cure it," she told Thomas, "but we can ease the suffering, keep patients clean, and keep them isolated from the healthy, which I believe slows the spread." Her rudimentary quarantine was centuries ahead of medicine. She practiced it from observation, not theory. Not everyone died. Perhaps 1 in 10 patients survived and walked out of Eleanor's ward. Each survivor was a living rebuke to the fatalism that De Harrow promoted. Then De Harrow struck. He filed a petition to evict Eleanor from the warehouse. He had purchased it from a dead owner's estate. Eleanor had no lease. Legally, she was a trespasser. He had waited for the right moment, and now he was using the courts to accomplish what he had failed to do through the council. Thomas felt clarity cut through his anger. "We do not need another location. We need to change the terms of the fight. How many lives has your center saved, Eleanor?" "Perhaps 50. 50 people with families and friends. That is not just medicine. That is a political constituency." Thomas spent 2 weeks going door to door. The response stunned him. People who had been beaten down by months of grief found a reservoir of energy they did not know they possessed. They were angry, not just at De Harrow, but at the entire system that had failed them. The corrupt officials who had fled when the plague arrived. The landlords who raised rents while tenants died. The church hierarchy that offered platitudes instead of practical help. De Harrow was a symbol of everything that was wrong, and opposing him was a way of reclaiming dignity and agency. Agnes turned the Crossed Keys into campaign headquarters, hosting meetings and feeding volunteers. Helena proved a skilled organizer, tracking supporters and coordinating logistics with quiet efficiency. Margaret gathered devastating testimonies from survivors and families. She had a gift for patience that made people trust her, and the stories she collected were heartbreaking in their specificity. Stories of workers nursed back to health who returned to their trades. Stories of families reunited. Stories of people given hope when hope had seemed impossible. Brother Edmund secured letters from prominent clergy. Father Richard organized prayer vigils. The day of the hearing, Thomas expected dozens. Hundreds came, filling the Guildhall courtyard and spilling into surrounding streets. De Harrow's lawyers presented crisp property law. Thomas rose and argued something larger. Is the law merely a mechanism for protecting the property of the wealthy? Or is it an instrument of justice? Outside this hall stand hundreds of people whose lives have been touched by Eleanor Burns' work. Survivors who would be dead without her care. He called survivors to testify. A mason nursed back from death's edge. A widow who survived because of the treatment she received. A merchant whose partners had already divided his assets before he recovered. Their raw testimonies carried a weight that no legal argument could match. DeHaro sat stone-faced, but Thomas saw something new in his eyes.
I can't do this alone.
Strategic doubt. He had miscalculated. The judges deliberated less than an hour. Ruling, DeHaro's ownership acknowledged, but given extraordinary circumstances, eviction was stayed for 1 year, while the council found alternative premises and compensated DeHaro fairly. Not total victory,
Thank you.
but Eleanor's work would continue. And the principle that community needs could override property rights in extraordinary times had profound implications for the future of English law. The crowd erupted in cheers. Eleanor found Thomas and took his hand, her sharp eyes bright with tears. "Thank you, Thomas. The people did it. You did it. I just knocked on doors. You showed us it was worth fighting for. That is no small thing." DeHaro passed without looking at them. Thomas felt a surprising flicker of pity. DeHaro understood wealth and power, but had failed to understand the one thing that mattered most in crisis: that human beings, pushed to the limit, were capable of a solidarity no money could buy and no cunning could defeat. That night, Thomas sat with Margaret and told her about the verdict. She listened, then asked a question that cut straight to the heart. "DeHaro will not forget this, will he?"
They are awake now.
"No," Thomas admitted.
Will never be the same.
Men like him never forget a defeat. But today was not about defeating DeHaro. It was about showing the people of this city that they still have a voice, that their suffering still matters, that someone is willing to fight for them. Whatever DeHaro does next, he cannot undo that. Margaret nodded slowly. Then it was worth it. Thomas looked at his wife and felt, for the first time in months, something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Not happiness, exactly. The world was still too broken for happiness, but something adjacent to it. Something like purpose. April arrived with the first tentative signs of spring. The death toll began to decline. Not dramatically, but enough for fragile hope to take root. Thomas noticed the shift. Conversations at the Crossed Keys expanded beyond death and disease to include plans, trade, even cautious laughter. Agnes served ale with something approaching her old spirit. Helena had grown into a confident businesswoman who surprised everyone, including herself. One mild afternoon, Thomas accompanied Eleanor through Aldgate. The devastation was staggering, entire blocks empty, doors hanging on rusted hinges, weeds pushing through cobblestones. But amid the desolation, signs of life. A woman hanging laundry between abandoned houses, white sheets snapping in the breeze like flags of defiance. A man repairing a wall stone by stone. Adults sharing bread and broth in a small courtyard, their conversation a low, companionable murmur. "Look at them," Eleanor said softly. "They have lost everything, and here they are, hanging laundry and mending walls and sharing food. Not grand gestures or heroic acts, just ordinary people doing ordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. Getting up in the morning, feeding themselves, taking care of each other. That is how civilizations survive catastrophe. Not through kings and lords, but through the dogged persistence of people who refuse to let the darkness win." Eleanor spoke of her dream, a permanent hospital where the sick poor could receive treatment regardless of ability to pay. She knew men like DeHaro would oppose it. But someone has to start. The plague has shown us what happens when a city has no organized system of care. We cannot go back. We have to build something better. Thomas promised to support her however he could. He did not know that Eleanor's vision would take centuries to fully materialize. But the seeds were being planted here, in these devastated streets, by people who had the courage to imagine a better world and the stubbornness to work toward it. In the days that followed, Thomas had one final encounter with William DeHaro. He was crossing through Cripplegate when he came upon DeHaro supervising renovations on one of his many acquired properties. Workers swarmed over the building while, in other parts of the city, bodies went uncollected. DeHaro noticed Thomas watching. "Come to admire my investments, Thomas? I have come to wonder at your priorities." DeHaro stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Let me tell you something, Thomas, and I say this without malice. You are going to end up with nothing. You are bleeding your savings dry for people who will forget your name the moment they no longer need you. In 5 years, I will own half this city. And you will be bankrupt, wondering where your noble intentions got you. Thomas looked at the man standing before him, wrapped in fur-trimmed robes in a city of rags and bones, and felt something settle inside him. Not anger, something quieter and more certain. Perhaps you are right, William. Perhaps I will end up with nothing. But I will be able to close my eyes at night without seeing the faces of people I left to die so that I could count my coins. Can you say the same? DeHarrow's jaw tightened. For just a moment, something flickered behind those calculating eyes. Not shame exactly, but perhaps the ghost of it. Thomas walked away without waiting for a response. Weeks passed. The plague continued to weaken its grip, slowly, unevenly, but perceptibly. Thomas found himself standing at his shop's threshold one morning, watching the street come to life with something almost resembling normalcy. Vendors were setting up stalls. People were haggling over prices. A cart loaded with grain rumbled past, heading toward a bakery that had recently reopened. The rhythms of commerce and daily life, battered and diminished but recognizably alive, were reasserting themselves. That evening, sitting with Margaret by the fire, Thomas spoke more openly than he usually did. "Margaret, I think we are going to make it." She looked at him with those clear, tired eyes. "What makes you say that?" "Because I saw something today that I had stopped believing in. I saw ordinary people standing up for each other. I saw a court listen to the powerless. I saw a community choose compassion over convenience. The cruelty is real. The greed is real. The suffering is real. But so is the kindness. So is the courage. So is the love." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. "Good," she said simply. They sat together as the fire burned low and the night settled over London. Outside their window, the city that had endured the greatest catastrophe in its history was still standing. And in the morning, its people would rise, as they had risen every morning for the past 2 years, and begin again the stubborn, exhausting, magnificent work of survival. Thomas Ashford did not know what the future held. He did not know that the plague would return again over the coming decades.
Just be careful.
He did not know that the labor shortages would continue to reshape English society, eventually eroding serfdom and giving rise to a more independent working class. He did not know that the challenges to church authority would deepen, setting the stage for great religious upheavals. He did not know that the ordinary people outside the Guildhall were participants in one of history's turning points. Eleanor's treatment center operated for 18 more months before the plague's intensity made it unnecessary. She spent her remaining years advocating for public sanitation and organized care, laying groundwork that future generations would build upon. Agnes kept the Crossed Keys open for 20 years, with Helena as her partner and one of the ward's most respected businesswomen. Brother Edmund became a vocal critic of church corruption, his writings contributing to the growing reform movement. DeHarrow died among London's richest men, but his name became a byword for greed, a reputation his descendants would spend generations trying to repair. Thomas never fully rebuilt his wool business. He died a man of modest means, but he died surrounded by people who loved him, his name spoken with warmth and gratitude by hundreds who remembered what he had done during the darkest chapter in their city's history. On his final night, Margaret sitting beside him, Thomas looked up at her and smiled. "We made it," he whispered. "Not just through the plague, through all of it. We kept our humanity, Margaret. That is the only thing that ever mattered." Margaret kissed his forehead and held his hand tight. Outside, she could hear the sounds of London at dusk, the distant clatter of a cart, the faint voices of people going about their lives, the bark of a dog somewhere on the next street, all the ordinary sounds of a city that had refused to die. "Yes," she said softly, "we did." And outside the window, London hummed with the restless, resilient energy of a city that had gone to the edge of the abyss and come back, changed, scarred, wiser perhaps, though wisdom bought at such a cost could hardly be called a blessing, but unbroken, forever, stubbornly, defiantly unbroken. If you watched until here, it is because this story truly moved you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and see who really connects with the stories on this channel. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves history, told through real human stories. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Because every week we bring stories you will not find anywhere else, stories that make you feel what it was like to live through the moments that shaped the world. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one.